Well, it's a great privilege now to welcome Dr. Stuart Judge, who is a university lecturer and reader in physiology in the University of Oxford. He got his first degree at Keele University in physics and mathematics, and after doing some voluntary service overseas, came back to Keele and did a PhD with Donald Mackay. He's had various university appointments since that, notably in Maryland, but now he is at Oxford, been there for a number of years. And his current research interests are in the neuroscience of vision. So we're looking forward very much, Stuart, to brains and persons this time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed interacting with some of you today. If you've been very acute, you will have noticed that Peter Clark, the previous speaker, and I shared a PhD supervisor. We nearly shared a postdoctoral supervisor as well, a rather remarkable and distinguished physiologist called David Whitridge, who, when the possibility of my following Peter was put to him, he said, "Can't stand the thought of trying to teach another chap not to cut skin with scissors." Because both Peter and I came from a non-medical background, and so we had our limitations initially. I should perhaps just say, for the benefit of those who don't know Latin, that the University of Oxford's motto is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord, i.e. the God of heaven and earth, is my light. And so despite certain of my colleagues in Oxford, like Richard Dawkins' protestations, there is very much a faith commitment behind the university. May I apologize that much of what I'm going to say is going to overlap with what Peter said, and I'll do my best to avoid boring you and to hasten on over things which are very similar. I just want to remind those of us who are scientists and those of us who are not, really the limitations of what we can say as scientists. So this is not perhaps a completely rigorous definition, but for me, science is about making, in principle, repeatable measurements or observations on events and drawing conclusions from them on the basis of logical argument. So there are lots of things that are true that I wouldn't call science. I hope you will believe me when I say that my mother loved her 4 children. I don't think I can really point to repeatable measurements to establish that, but there's certainly a data that lead one to have no doubt on that. I've spent much of my career recording the activity of individual nerve cells, often in monkeys performing relatively simple tasks, and trying to tease out the role that those nerve cells are playing in producing the behavior or in processing the sensory stimuli that drive it. And I follow those people who believe that Popper, the philosopher, made a very good point in saying that if we want to have an assertion which is scientific, then one really has to identify evidence that would knock it down, count against it. And if one can't come up with evidence against what one says, then it really isn't a scientific statement. Now, I can't restrict myself to purely scientific statements on this subject, because there are inevitably conceptual issues and issues where one has to appeal to a wider sense of data than repeatable measurements and observations. But I'll try to say when I'm giving a scientific and a non-scientific opinion. So here is the outline of my talk. I'm going to say in a slightly different way a number of things that have been said before about reductionism and its limitations. I'm going to take you through some very simple kinds of decision-making and some observations that have been made about the processes that may or may not account for them. And I'm going to take you through a miscellany of ideas round about that thought, and I'm going to end up with just a little bit in the way of a specific experiment looking for neural correlates of religious experience. So, some of you have probably read The Selfish Gene. Here's a quotation, bit of purple prose from The Selfish Gene. Now they swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They're in you and me, they created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. Now, I invite you to consider whether that is a scientific statement. Richard Dawkins is certainly a scientist by training, but does it meet the Popperian test? What would count as evidence against that? Now, I'm not quite going to put it to that test because just as I was preparing this talk, my colleague Dennis Noble published a book called The Music of Life, and in the first chapter of that, he actually applies a slightly different test, which is he says this. Now, suppose you just invert that paragraph. You don't say that the genes are in control. You say, now they're trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, and so on. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence. And what Dennis Noble has done is he's played this game a number of times, and he's asked people to say, actually, what's the experiment that would tell you who are the prisoners? Whether we are the prisoners of our genes or our genes are the prisoners of the organism in which they live. And according to Dennis, you might differ. Actually, it's rather difficult to come up with an experiment. And apparently in a later book, Dawkins has said, I doubt whether there's any experiment that could be done to prove my claim. Well, in that case, that's not science. Okay? Now, a few years ago, there was really quite an unusual article in what was then a new venture by the Nature family of journals, Nature Neuroscience, in the form of an editorial on neuroscience and the human spirit, in which one of the points that was made is that one of the challenges that neuroscience has presented is whether the concept of free will can be sustained in the face of increasing knowledge of what's going on in the brain while animals and to some extent humans come to a decision. And Crick, the late Nobel Prize winner, was quoted as a skeptic on the subject of free will. Now, this is covering ground we've already covered, so I won't hover on that. But I would like to make the point that a sort of materialistic spirit, if you like, to mix metaphors, is abroad in quite unexpected places. So this is a very well-known textbook of medicine, been around for 30 years or so. So one of my recent medical students said, my dad was shocked to see that we're still using the same textbook he used. And there's from the preface to that, thus the human being is actually an automaton, and the fact that we are sensing, feeling, and knowledgeable beings as part of this automatic sequence of life. Now that's a book that's given to medics beginning their studies. So there is a spirit of what I would call negative reductionism, the idea that if one can find a mechanistic account of our behavior in terms of what goes on in our brain, that would somehow invalidate our common sense experience as conscious agents. Now, I don't believe that for a reason that's not a scientific reason, it's a logical reason. And this is actually a quote, again from Dennis Noble, but you can find similar thoughts going back a long way. And the problem with this kind of reductive argument is that if we could reduce rational behavior to molecular or cellular causation, we wouldn't actually be able to meaningfully express that we'd done that. We know what it is to be rational, and if you try to say, I've come up with an argument that has undermined the reality of rational discourse, then that's self-defeating. It knocks down too much. So this is, again, a quote from Dennis Noble's new book. I quote it because he's not speaking from a faith commitment. He's speaking from the point of view of a biologist who's thought rather carefully and with some philosophical input about the inadequacies of radical reductionism. Now, I would go a little bit further from beyond what's been said by the previous two speakers, perhaps slightly in the direction of something like Berkeleyan idealism, by saying that I actually think that our conscious experience has a sort of priority above the story about our brains, because think about how we create the story about our brains. How do we know there are atoms and molecules and neurons and all the rest of it? Well, we know that because we're conscious agents who do experiments and make observations at the bench. Now, you don't have to be a postmodernist or a relativist to see that something has gone logically wrong if, as a result of that process, you start saying, oh, that's all nonsense, it's an illusion. Because again, that's undercut the whole enterprise. So for me at least, what we see as conscious agents in the lab is a more undeniable fact than the conclusions we draw about microscopic entities and about the operations of the cells we believe to be in the brain. So if I had to make a choice, then I'm an idealist. But I don't expect to be driven to that. Now, there is something I immediately have to say, and that's I don't want to say that I am a naive believer in the validity of everything we consciously experience. I don't know whether there are any red buses left in Cambridge these days, but if there are, you've probably had that experience of there's a bus coming down the street that you see, and then you turn around and actually it isn't a bus. It's a balloon that a child's carrying or something else altogether different. So it's perfectly possible for our perceptions to be an inaccurate inference, if you like, about what's out there. But I think to erect on that kind of basis any kind of radical doubt about the reliability of our perception is a mistake. So that's where I am in terms of my philosophical framework, if you like, not as a science. Now I want to go to the science, and I want to talk about a very well-known bit of science, not terribly modern, and I want to try to say how it might look from a dualist point of view and from a non-dualist point of view. So this is the task of pressing a button, okay? But pressing a button not when someone tells you to do it or when some light comes up or sound comes up, just pressing it when you feel like doing it. And then doing it again when you feel like doing it. And doing it a number of times for reasons that will become clear later. Now, a dualist account of this would go something like this. At some point before each press, you make a mental decision to initiate action, and somehow, at one or many points in the brain, the mental act of deciding alters ongoing activity in some way so as to set in motion an observable chain of physical events in the brain that lead to the appropriate muscular contractions and pressing the button. So if one wanted to pick a plausible brain region for this to happen, then you'd probably go for somewhere up in the frontal cortex or perhaps in the interconnected parietal areas. And that's just what a man whose name has been mentioned already, Eccles, the Nobel Prize-winning neurophysiologist, did some years ago. And he plumped for this area, the supplementary motor cortex, on the midline towards the front of the cortex, as the area in which the mind and the brain interacted, what he called the liaison brain. So there's an example of classical dualism. The problem with this is that there's there's a presupposition behind that, which is there's a kind of gap in the neural processes, or about the supplementary motor cortex, and there's no evidence that there is. It's actually a reasonable area to bet on if you're going to bet on, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that area. It's roughly indicated by where those notional recording electrodes are, up on the front of the brain of the caricatured subject there. And if you stick little electrodes over the frontal part of the scalp, you can record what's called a readiness potential that builds up for nearly a second before the button is actually pushed and then collapses about when you push it. So there is, if you like, an electrical anticipation of the button push. This is old data. It's been known about for a generation. It was originally discovered in Germany, and that's why it has a German name if one's going to be exact about it. More recent data, okay, so the kind of question that has been asked is, well, okay, why don't we ask the subject doing this experiment when they decided to push the button? Okay? And how you do that, or how Libet did it 20 plus years ago, is he had a dot revolving around a clock face, actually with no numbers on it, quite quickly, and he asked the subjects to note where the dot was when they decided to press the button. And by where the dot was and knowing its rate of revolution and the relative timing, they could work out the accounted time of the decision. And what was then noticed was this was quite late in the readiness potential, only a couple of 100 milliseconds before the beginning of the button push. And so some have argued that what this means is that the brain had decided, before the subject was consciously aware of having decided, that the button was going to be pushed, and that the mental sense of deciding is therefore an epiphenomenon. Now, I think that's extravagant because it assumes just what needs proof, which is that the early phase of that rising readiness potential is a neural correlate of making a decision. Or to put it another way, it assumes more than you can probably assume about what the subject is telling you when they say, in terms of where the dot was, when they made the decision. Well, what are they actually telling you? Suppose they're telling you the time at which they could have done something else. Then it's quite plausible that that is that late in the process. And those earlier events, electrical events in the brain, are then a correlate of something a little different from the mental event the subject's reporting. Yeah.
Summarize it. So people decide, but they act before deciding it. Could you repeat the question?
Okay, the question is, could I summarize this a little bit and say what it is that's before and what's after? The Libet story puts together two things. If you ask the subject to tell you when they decided to push the button, in terms of they're telling you a little later where the dot was on the spinning dot clock face when they think they pushed the button, that is a only about 200 milliseconds before they actually push the button, and quite late in that increasing potential that you can record just by sticking a little electrode on the scalp. So there are two constructions of this observation. The materialist one is that the readiness potential is an indication that the brain has already, quote, decided to push the button, and the conscious realization that that's so then follows the brain's commitment. My problem with that is that that is assuming that the subject is telling you the same sort of thing as the brain cells are, and that isn't a safe conclusion from this naive an experiment. So that's what I'm saying. It was a reasonable, if you wanted to pick an area, supplementary motor cortex would be a reasonable one for reasons like this. This is an experiment from 25 years ago that's been repeated by a number of techniques. This one by Roland et al. Was using an early form of brain imaging. So you just get these kind of cartoons of what's going on. The subject here is just flexing the finger like this, and that activates a region of the cortex that's known to be involved both in wiggling the fingers of the hand and in the sensation that's correlated with that. So the motor cortex and the corresponding somatic cortex sensing contact with that surface. If, however, what you ask the subject to do is to do something like play a little bit of a tune on the piano with the fingers of one hand, so a sequence, run off a sequence of finger movement, then you get not only activation of that motor and sensory cortex with the simple act, but also activation of this supplementary motor area. Now what you do is you ask the subject not to actually make that sequence of finger movements, but to mentally rehearse it. So just think, first I had to press the first finger, then I pressed the second and fourth together, then I pressed the third, then I went back to the first. What then happens is you only get activation of the supplementary motor cortex. So that's the kind of evidence that led people like Eccles to say, oh, this is just what I want as a dualist. It's an area of the brain which is involved in mental rehearsal of an activity without actually carrying it out. The problem with that interpretation is we have absolutely no grounds for thinking there's any kind of break in the processing of signals round various circuits of the brain in the supplementary motor cortex, and in fact research suggests just the opposite. So there isn't, if you like, a gap in the sequence for the extra physical activity to operate. Now, a monist would say something like that the act of voluntarily deciding when to press the button would have a neural correlate, something going on at a different level described in a semantically different universe, perhaps in terms of slowly increasing noisy signals reaching a threshold that would correspond to the decision to press the button. And my position is that I don't think we really know which of these stories is true, but we do know more and more about the way in which signals chase round circuits in the brain that is adding to a weight of evidence against the idea that there are gaps in the chain of cause and effect anyway. So I just want to have an aside here about an experiment that came along just a week or two ago. And this was flagged in Nature last week as a link between mind and machine that can turn thought into movement. Well, that sounds like something that would be just about right for this meeting, doesn't it? It's a very touching story, and I think it's worthwhile taking you through, but it's also educative for what it doesn't show. This is a tetraplegic subject. He had a knife injury that severed his spinal cord at the C4 level, for those of you into these things. So he cannot move either arm or leg And if you look carefully, that blue gizmo is the tube leading off to the machine that's providing his respiration. So he can't breathe for himself. So this is somebody in a poor state who's mentally all right, but can't do a whole lot. And what a bunch of scientists in the States has done as a pilot experiment, not to offer him a long-term prosthesis, but to see whether this has potential for the future, is implanted an array of 100 recording electrodes over the motor cortex, actually over the arm area of the motor cortex, and that's what's indicated in that little square on the brain scan there. And what they then do is ask the patient to imagine, the patient's looking at a computer screen, as you see in the previous one, and what the experimenter does is moves the cursor in different directions and asks the patient to imagine that their hand was following the cursor, either up the screen or down or left or right. Record the array of signals in that recording array, and then use those stored signals to interpret spontaneously generated signals that the subject makes shortly afterwards. And then all they did was ask the subject, okay, now go ahead and try to move the cursor by imagining that you are actually moving it. And that actually works. And I just want to show you the movie. And this is a little bit small, I'm afraid, but I think you'll get a feel for it.
Okay, so here's the cybernetics desktop. What do you want to do first? Okay.
That's the subject saying, I want to open my email first. And he is now moving the cursor in this rather shaky way by thinking about the movement he wants to make. He's reading his email.
Very good. Okay.
You see, it's not perfect. This kind of random wandering of the cursor means he can't do it perfectly.
So what's next? You're going to draw a circle. Wow.
Now he's having a little bit of difficulty in doing something which is a much more tricky motor task, like drawing a free-form circle.
You avoided the eraser that time. Okay.
I think we'll stop there for the minute. You get the general idea. Now this is marvelously encouraging from the point of view of prostheses for deeply physically handicapped people, but does it mean what the experimenters hyped it as meaning? In the commentary, it was converting thoughts into action. Well, but is it? I don't think it is at all. What's happening here is that the recording device is tapping into an area of the brain that's towards the output end of the pathways that actually direct movement. So these are nerve cells that have to fire if you're going to make movements of the hand of any precision. So all it's actually doing is recording from the cells that are normally involved in fairly immediately directing the action and reconnecting those to the cursor rather than to the actual hand. So it's valuable as a prosthesis, but what you don't really have here is a link between the mental and the physical in any strong sense. And in particular, I don't believe that the patient was doing the task by imagining the movement in the strong sense, because of the observations I just showed you, that actually if you really just imagine a movement as a normal subject, that doesn't activate the area of the primary cortex where this recording electrode is. It only activates the the earlier areas in the pathway. So I think what the subject's doing is they're trying to make the movement that they can't make because there's no connection to their motor neurons. That's been severed. And what's interesting about the observations, and the authors do flag this up, is that all this is happening many months after the injury, actually years after the injury, and many months after the recording device was implanted. So the subject has retained the ability to produce the appropriate discharges in the neurons which are still there, and they might have died, even a long time after the injury that's disconnected those from the outside world. But it's not converting thought into action. I'm not going to go much deeper into the kinds of experiments that have been done on looking at more complicated tasks than pressing a button, but I do want to say that much more complicated tasks have been studied where, for example, with monkeys, there's a small repertoire of, say, movements of the eyes the animal has to make, and the animal is playing a game against the computer so that the rewards it gets will depend on which choices it makes, the history of the choices, and what the computer predicts it will do. But you can find neural activity in various parts in the brain that all provides a plausible substrate for the logical processes that must underlie choosing which of several actions to make and making adjustments according to how greatly you're rewarded for the different choices. But here's some quotes from a paper reviewing that kind of research that I'd like to take issue with. This is by John Schall, who's done a number of these experiments. And he says a fundamental goal of neuroscience is to understand how mental entities like reasons and desires derive from processes in the brain. Now, my problem with that is, what do you mean by derived? Or specifically, what do you deny by using that word derived? Is that an empirical issue? So perhaps we could discuss this, but I think this is quite close to the debate between people who are and are not dualists about what's going on in the brain once we grant that there are processes in the brain that could account for the behavior. Many of us will want to take issue with people who have a sort of reductive approach like this, that regard demonstration of the physical chain of events as knocking down the mental explanation, but I'm not sure that we want to argue with the idea that there may be no gap in the physical processes. So actually all that's been described so far is that you can generate plausible models to explain how still fairly simple but more complex than pressing buttons behavioral choices can be accounted for by chains of signals in the brain. But my argument is, so what? What does that prove philosophically? Now, before I stop and open up to questions, I want to just offer you some free-ranging thoughts about a kind of terminology that's often used, at least at the popular level, in thinking about brain and mind, which is to talk about dimensions, different dimensions of reality. And sometimes people will talk about physical and mental and spiritual dimensions. And whilst not wanting to reject the idea that there's some validity in that kind of terminology, I do just want to ask people to think a little bit more carefully about it in terms of pursuing the analogy rather rigorously, perhaps too rigorously. So let's think of the analogy along the following ways. Think of a classical machine, piece of clockwork like this one from somewhere in Italy. So cogs and gears, and let's imagine that it's all restricted to one plane, it's not all restricted to one plane, but you're in a world where you can only see the 2 dimensions of the plane, then what will you observe? An observer restricted to what, in a famous exploration of this idea of dimensions, Abbott called flatland, would not be able to see the machinery hidden in the 3rd dimension, and so the connections through axles or levers that extended into the 3rd dimension would be unobservable. Their effects would be observable, but if there were power sources in the 3rd dimension, so to speak, you might see unprecedented events in the single plane. So that's been offered as a metaphor for thinking about how mental events might cause brain events if the mental events are kind of in a 3rd dimension. Now, the problem with that, as I see it, the various problems, but the main one is that the evidence is against it. The evidence going back over many years now is there's a much more intimate linkage between physical events in different parts of the brain and our mental experience. There's a high degree of correlation, in other words, between the extra dimension, the mental dimension, the physical dimension. And that actually makes the analogy unhelpful, because once there's a strong correlation between the different dimensions, actually there really isn't a 3rd dimension. The number of degrees of freedom is no bigger. If you want to vary the idea of dimensionality, suppose we consider that the extra dimension is visible, but as a projection onto the lower dimensions. So this is a situation like this. So here's a 2-dimensional image. And I'd like to ask you what you see then when I do that. Sure. You see some dots move one way and some move the other way, right? If I actually start this movie and run it, then what's really there is something rather different, as I think most of you will see, which is actually a 3-dimensional drum with some of the dots moving around the front of it and some of them moving around the back. Okay, so that's just to indicate that if there are more dimensions there than you think they are, then you can make mistakes about causality, and some of those dots that appear to hit one another or pass through one another actually are not coincident because they're in front or back one another. But I'm afraid if you think about this a bit more carefully, this really doesn't help the mind-brain issue. So it might be a little bit in common with ghosts. You know, you've got events that can collide, apparently collide with one another but not interact. Because again, the problem is that if the values of dimensions in the 2 dimensions and the 3rd dimension are correlated in a way that we have good reason to believe physical events in the brain and the mental events are, there really isn't an extra degree of freedom to supply what the dualists are looking for through this analogy. Both Gareth and Peter have referred to a rather nice term that Peter and my mentor Donald Mackay coined of nothing buttery, and I just want to take you around an analogy that he sometimes used, or a variation of it. So this is rather like Peter's analogy about the notice on the lecture board. Here's a different one. I've got some lines and curves that we would normally read as DOG. Now, what's the semantic content of that? It's certainly not that these are just lines and curves, nothing but spots of light. What they actually represent is, you know, that animal there, which happens to be our family dog. And I'd like to reiterate what, in some sense, Gareth and Peter already said, which is, if there's one thing we can probably agree about, it's that there's a philosophical mistake in asserting that we are nothing but the material processes, because that doesn't take account of the fact that once some kind of physical entities represent or betoken something else with semantic content, they can't be nothing but. Now, just briefly to take you round a recent paper on brain correlates of religious experience. There's a paper a few years ago by Azari et al. Using positron emission tomography. So this is a type of brain scanning. And what they did is they took a small number of subjects, all German, and some of them were from a small Christian group. Those sort of so-called religious subjects, and some were secular university students with no religious beliefs. And they had each of them read in different occasions either the first verse of Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," or two other passages, one of which was a much-loved German nursery rhyme, and the other of which was something from the telephone directory. And they compared the activation in different parts of the brain in these three different tasks and between the religious and the non-religious subjects. And they found that in a couple of parts of the brain, there seemed to be some specific activation of the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex of the religious subjects when they were reflecting on a religious passage that meant something to them. But I actually think there's nothing surprising about that in almost any hypothesis, because all it shows, and actually, if you read the paper carefully, they're quite honest about this, is it shows that there's more going on than some feeling, because the areas of the brain that are activated are not the right ones for just having an amorphous feeling. They're the areas that are right for some sort of reflective activity. Well, I suspect this has got nothing to do with religion, that if you took an ardent Marxist and you picked out a nice passage from the Communist Manifesto about the glorious age of the future, then you'd probably get just those kind of areas activated. Or dare I say it, if you took the editor of The Economist and a nice purple bit of prose from J.S. Mill, you might even find the same thing. So I think that while this is interesting, it doesn't prove a whole lot. I'm going to stop there. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, Stuart. So, any questions?
I've sent everybody to sleep. You can
quite a bit and enjoyed the philosophical sophistication of it. I do have a bit of a question about what the work is about separating science from non-science, or if it does the work that you do. I want to consider maybe two further non-scientific statements. There are not electrons, but there are electrons. I'm forgetting which one I want here. Sorry. Here's one. So the Earth really is 4.5 billion years old, rather than just looking that way. By your criterion, that's going to be a non-scientific statement.
Correct. I believe the Goss argument is one that is not a matter of scientific argument.
I'm sorry?
Goss is the person
I was not
who
giving
first
his argument. I was giving an inverse. The statement that the Earth really is that old, rather than being created to look that way, is also not scientific. That I take it as slightly less obvious, but nonetheless
Sorry,
the case.
Goss's argument, as I understand it, was that things were created to look extremely ancient, even though they really aren't. So, okay.
Right.
It
I'm
is
doing
the
it the other way
argument.
around.
But
At least
I agree with you, yes.
Okay.
I don't think either of those are scientific statements. There's no observable way you can differentiate them.
I guess you're content with that then.
I'm content with that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's extremely interesting. I don't know whether Bob would want to comment on whether it's a scientific statement that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old.
No, the difference. The question was whether you could scientifically differentiate that it really is, or that it's exactly as though it looks as it is. Now, I don't think you can. I think that's essentially the limitations of science. A scientist would say, the assertion that it really isn't that old is therefore, it has no added content from the other one, but I don't think there are scientific objections that lead one to dislike the "it looks as though it was" argument.
Rodney asked me to comment because I'm a geologist. No, I think there is a difference. It may be impossible to tell observationally if God had made a world that was 10,000 years old but made everything to look as if it was 4,500 million years old, then it may be impossible to tell, for us to tell as his created creatures, because presumably he'd be clever enough to make things that fooled us. But I don't think that's a scientific statement, you see, because I think there are so many different tests of whether it is in fact actually older or not, that the only way that it could look old but not be old is if God had deceived us, and then that would be counter to all sorts of other issues about how we understand God.
But I agree with you entirely, but that's not actually a scientific argument, is my point.
You're saying that's a theological argument. But I think it is a scientific argument, because the basis of science is that things as we observe them to be are actually how they are, with all the caveats
We'll have to
uncertainty principle and so on.
But Occam's razor is also not science.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Next week we will have about how science works, what makes it rational and so on, and the same for religion. And I think that is a very interesting point, because it is a philosophical issue. I think I'm kind of getting the drift here. Okay, shall we move on?
Then cosmology is not science.
Sorry?
Study of, cosmological principles or cosmology, will you consider it as science? Now people say sociology is science, economics is science.
I was trying to phrase a definition that would include cosmology that could be connected to observational tests. So that was specifically in mind. I do think that some cosmologists have strayed into areas where it's extremely difficult to know whether one's talking about science or not. To posit a whole infinite number of alternative universes in order to explain how we are, that makes my blood run cold as an experimental scientist, I must admit.
And
I didn't mean to exclude cosmology.
right, and neural correlates of human thoughts, desires, conscious experience. Ultimately, it boils down to oak tree, hydrocarbon, water, H2O. So, there are two different levels. Water means something, and H2O, all the water, is not exactly what it means. In our conscious world. So, do you think we are kind of encroaching upon an area where the problem is unsolvable, in the sense that oak tree is hydrocarbon, but not that only hydrocarbon, or human beings are macromolecules, but not just macromolecules. So for religious experience, there is neural correlate, but it's not just neuronal activity.
I don't think you can decide on the validity of what is going on at the level of thought and experience by looking at what's going on in the brain events, except under very special conditions. So obviously, if someone has a seizure and they start thrashing around their arms and legs, as people do with a seizure, then I think it would be a very brave soul who would say anything other than that that's their brain working wrongly. I will be... I think it's possible to imagine particular stories about rationality being adjusted by reference to more complete knowledge about the brain. What I think is extremely unlikely is that any kind of radical doubt about rationality per se can can arise out of further knowledge of the brain, because I don't see how that can happen without pulling down the whole show. I mean, how can you maintain belief in all the other constructed entities like electrons and so on if rationality has itself been thrown into doubt?
And ultimately it comes down to the meaning of meaning or meaning of explanation. If you want to
Yes.
explain Beethoven's music in terms of, air pressure waves, Einstein also pondered over it, this question, what does it mean? Or, that's my religious experience in terms of some action potentials or ERP, what does it really mean? I mean, and it may be satisfactory to some people like Daniel Dennett, but it may not be satisfactory to me or someone else. So we cannot have the answer to the satisfaction of all. Probably we are going to that area. It will be satisfactory to some people, but not all people of all disciplines to the equal degree. Perhaps.
I'm not quite so pessimistic.
Okay.
I think people will see the kind of reductive materialism as something that isn't actually sustainable from the evidence.
Okay. Thank you.
More questions? Yes?
Well, thank you for the presentation. At some point you described your position, but I wasn't probably sophisticated enough to understand. Like you mentioned idealism or dualism. I mean, how would you exactly, more easy to understand in a way to describe, how do you see it?
I should have said, I'm very amateur at these philosophical things, so I'm not sure I can describe my position with any precision. My position is, I think it's a mistake to believe that the world as described by science is more real than the world as known by common sense experience. So I'm not sure whether to describe that as a kind of idealism or not, but it's I think of myself as a kind of monist, a kind of dual aspect monist, but actually, yes, but actually I think the conscious experience has a kind of priority, because it's to deny that it is so, we deny so much that you can't actually erect the other story. I mean, if I'm not seeing the record on my oscilloscope trace when I'm doing the experiments, and I'm not honestly reporting it to my colleagues in the journals, then I haven't discovered how the brain cells actually work. So that's the kind of connection that I'm trying to make, and I don't know what the exact philosophical terminology for that is.
More questions? Yes?
Just a query about the possible relevance of the paranormal in thinking about real. Can I just put a point? Suppose that someone has a remarkable vision,
Yes.
Of which seems to him to be conclusive evidence of the reality of God.
Yeah.
I rather presume that his mental experiences and any measurements you took on his neurons would be very similar to a more normal experience.
I don't know that. I've tried not to say anything about this issue on rather the same grounds that I think Peter avoided it, which is if one adopts the sort of characteristic stance of an empirical scientist, you actually can't say a whole lot about unusual, unpredictable events that you can't actually get in the lab and study. So I think if you're a theist and you believe in an almighty creator, all bets are off on whether he is going to act according to his usual pattern of behavior, and that's what we call scientific laws, or whether something unprecedented might happen. And so I think once you operate in a strong theistic framework of thinking, you have to be very careful about having any particular view about unprecedented events, because completely possible in that worldview for there to be for God to act in an unprecedented way, and you have no experimental way of knowing when he's going to do that. But I mean, and this would be perhaps a little bit more controversial, my reading of history is that documented unprecedented events, at least in the cultures I'm familiar with, are relatively rare. So as a very tenuous conclusion, I would suggest that we have reason to think that the Almighty generally acts in his accustomed way, and unprecedented events are relatively unusual. This is a weak argument, but I would take the view that, as far as I know, we don't have any reasons to think that unprecedented events are any more common in the bit of the universe in the top of our skulls than in all the rest of it. C.S. Lewis took the opposite view. He thought that every time we had a rational thought, there was a miracle, and something unprecedented happened. Perhaps we should stop and have supper on that.
Well, shall we stop at that? Oh, there's more. Come on.
Can we just pursue for a moment your last section on brain correlates of religious experience?
Yes.
Because it'd be interesting to hear your views about the studies that Susan Greenfield is carrying out in Oxford, which you'll be able to no doubt describe more accurately than me.
No, I can't. I know of them. I know of them, and I know the scientist who's actually doing the work, but I haven't actually been involved.
Well, let's just explore it for a moment, if we may, because of course it has received a lot of exposure, and this is the study where, as I understand it, it's intended to take people whose brain activation will be recorded by PET scanning or by MRI or some other mechanism.
Yeah.
They will be exposed to a stimulus which would create pain or some degree of suffering in order to mimic the pictures that were seen of people who were put on the rack during the Inquisition, who supposedly were able to bear suffering more effectively if they were looking at religious images. Now, do you feel there is a way into trying to investigate, particularly the issue of suffering, by this type of experimentation? Obviously, it's an attempt to try to do something experimental, but there are all sorts of questions.
The lead scientist on this is actually a woman called Irene Tracy, who's a good scientist and is making her career through looking at using functional magnetic resonance imaging at how much more we can understand about a very vexed subject in neuroscience and practical medicine, which is why we feel pain when we do. The reason it's not quite obvious, it's an old observation of people in emergency medicine that one can have the most dreadful injuries, and if the context demands it, people plausibly deny feeling pain. So if you're rushing out on the battlefield to get your buddy who's in no man's land and is going to die if you don't get him, you can have half your leg shot away and you can get back, and it'll be some time before you feel pain. So there's a well-known distinction between having a physical event that causes massive discharge of receptors that are, if you like, the front end of pain sensation, and actually feeling it. So I'm not sure this is a well-designed experiment as it was accounted in the public literature, but essentially what they're trying to get at is an old question which is relatively orthogonal to religion, which is whether some people feel pain differently given the same physical sensation. So, and without the brain scanning, this has been done before. So, for instance, if you take Nepalese Sherpas, really very, very tough people spending their whole lives in very testing circumstances in every way, and you give them electrical shocks at an intensity that somebody who hasn't lived that kind of hard life will say is jolly painful, then they won't say the same things. They won't say it's jolly painful. But if you ask them to do a slightly different task of, rating the strength of the sensation and determining when it gets sufficiently small that they can't detect it at all, then actually it's very similar data. So it's some kind of, it's known there's a dissociation. Whether it's different for religious people, I don't know. But I personally don't think there's a great deal that's going to come out of this that's new. But Irene Tracy is a good scientist, so I may be wrong.
Maybe one last question, and then, is that, yeah.
Is there any analogy between trance and epileptical seizure? I have seen a part of a macumba ceremony in Brazil, and there were people falling in trance. I don't know if it was genuine or theater. But are there analogies?
I really don't know. There's a type of seizure called an absent seizure, where you don't have uncontrollable movements of the body. You just kind of not with it for a bit. But I don't even know whether there's anything in common with that and trance. Don't know. I could look into it.
I think if we stop there, then of course there will be more questions later on for the panel, and more to Dr. Judge and others on the panel later on. So a very big thank you.